American historians have a saying, a nation does not mature by tranquility, but by times of trial. These trials often arise from conflicts, from the clash between the yearning for freedom and the pressure of stronger forces. On the land that would one day be called the United States, ordinary people faced a choice: continue life as they knew it, or embark on a new, uncertain path. Our story begins on a late 18th century morning. Under the thin mist of the eastern seaboard, Jonathan Hale, the printer, stepped out of his small wooden house. In the rising sun, he saw his neighbors gathered in the square. A new notice had been posted on the town's large billboard, sent from across the ocean. A new tax on printing paper. To many, it was just another fee, but to Jonathan, it was a clear signal that their lives were no longer their own to decide. As the town's newspaper printer, he knew this would stifle the very voice they were trying to build. The town's mayor, Spencer Rowan, watched the crowd with a wary eye, sensing the growing frustration. "We can't stay silent," one person muttered. "But what can we do about it?" Another replied, his voice laced with resignation. Jonathan stood back, clutching a roll of printing paper. He was no leader, no hero, just an ordinary citizen. But his frustration had reached a breaking point. He saw a simple truth: if they kept waiting for someone else to act, nothing would ever change. That afternoon, he returned to his printing shop and did something he'd never dared to do before. He began printing leaflets. They weren't calls to arms or attacks on authority, just a single, powerful question: who decides our future? The leaflets spread quietly through the town, then to neighboring communities, carried by travelers and merchants. A week later, a spontaneous meeting took place in the town. No one spoke for any organization. It was simply the people, gathered together. Jonathan stood in the crowd, listening as his neighbors shared their thoughts. A woman was the first to speak, her voice trembling but firm. She explained that her son now had to work twice as hard due to new collection policies. A blacksmith followed, saying he could no longer control the price of his own raw materials. A shared feeling swept through the crowd. They were all losing control over their own lives. Under the warm glow of an oil lamp, an idea was born. They needed a unified voice, a way to express their desire for autonomy. They didn't want confrontation, but they refused to be dependent. It was in that meeting that the American spirit of self-determination began to take shape. Jonathan never expected his small act to spark such a wave, but he also understood that every movement needs someone to take the lead. With his natural charisma and calm demeanor, Spencer Rowan was chosen as the town's representative. He would attend a meeting with representatives from other areas to discuss their shared future. When Spencer returned from his long journey, the look on his face made everyone hold their breath. He wasn't happy, nor was he disappointed. He was just pensive. "It's not just our town," he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Many other places are under the same pressure, and they want change, too." The news spread like wildfire. To turn their consensus into action, the representatives decided to send a formal petition. It expressed their desire for self-governance in some internal matters, a reasonable request made in good faith. They hoped the authorities across the ocean would listen and make adjustments. But when the response finally came, it was clear their plea had fallen on deaf ears. The request was not considered. No one wanted the tension to escalate, but the silence from the other side unintentionally pushed these communities closer together. They held more meetings, debated more fiercely, and their gatherings grew larger and more determined. It was then that an event occurred that changed everything. News of a collision at sea reached the town. It was a small incident, but it was enough to awaken even the most hesitant among them. A chilling realization dawned. Things might not remain peaceful for much longer. From this anxiety, new ways of thinking emerged. If they wanted to be truly independent, they had to be able to protect themselves. This is when the concept of self-defense forces was first mentioned. These weren't professional armies, just groups of volunteers practicing basic defense drills to ensure the safety of their town in case of trouble. At first, some people laughed it off as an overreaction, but as more tense news trickled in, the number of participants grew. Jonathan wasn't a skilled fighter, but he contributed in his own way. He printed documents outlining rules and defense plans. He even wrote articles encouraging unity, his words becoming the glue that held their resolve together. One spring evening, as he worked late in his printing shop, Spencer walked in, his face solemn. "Jonathan," he said, his voice low, "what we feared has come to pass. A force is moving toward the town. They might just be coming to inspect, but the people are worried." Jonathan put down the freshly printed paper. He knew this was a moment history would remember, not for the noise of chaos, but for the quiet choices of people standing up to a challenge. The next morning, the town square was packed. Spencer stood in the middle, looking at each familiar face. "We don't want confrontation," he said clearly, his voice steady. "We just want to protect our own peace. A small town like ours can't change the world, but we can at least show them that we have a stand." The people nodded in unison. There was no anger, no desire for violence, but they stood tall, a quiet wall of resolve. As the armed force approached, they were met by the sight of hundreds of people standing still, not advancing, not retreating. They were simply demonstrating their right to self-determination, their refusal to be imposed upon. The force halted. An officer stepped forward and announced his intention to inspect the area. Spencer agreed, but with conditions. They could only inspect necessary areas and must not disrupt people's lives. The exchange was tense, but it remained stable. Crucially, chaos was averted. Neither side took that fateful step into violence. But for the people of the town, it was a profound moment of understanding. When a community is united and rational, it can hold its ground without resorting to extremes. Word of the event spread to other areas, becoming a powerful symbol of the spirit of self-determination. Towns across the region began to follow suit, organizing delegations, discussing strategies, and creating plans to protect their citizens. Unity was spreading not by the sword, but by the strength of will. Jonathan, the once unknown printer, became a spiritual symbol for many. He didn't shout slogans or lead charges. He simply did what his conscience told him was right. And that's what made his actions so influential. Spencer, with his clear vision, was invited to a great conference of the regions. Here, for the first time in history, people seriously discussed establishing a new kind of institution, one where citizens elected their representatives, where the future was decided not by a distant power, but by the very people living on the land. This conference wasn't a declaration of independence, but it was the beginning of the idea of autonomy, an idea that would guide the United States for centuries to come. When Spencer finally returned, he brought a message of hope. "We don't know what the future holds," he told the waiting townspeople, "but we do know that what happened here will be remembered as a milestone, a battle without a single shot fired, but one that changed the fate of countless people, a battle we won with calmness, reason, and unity." Jonathan looked out at the distant fields, where the sun was setting. He didn't know where the world would go from here, but he knew one thing for sure. What they had started would not stop. It was the first flame, a quiet fire that would pave the way for greater events to come, for battles fought not just with force, but with intelligence, will, and an unyielding desire for freedom. Thanks for watching. If you found this story inspiring, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter in history.